Sometimes a life begins deep in the mud, and sometimes silence is the loudest scream. A man opened his door to a girl fleeing from her past, but this was never just an act of kindness. In a world of land, guns, and unspoken deals, they would both have to rediscover who they really were. A silence that grips your soul, and a fate born from fire. Now begins. Chapter 1. A breath alone in the mud. The wind carried a low, mournful hum across the barren edge of the border town, sweeping over cracked soil and waterlogged roots like a song with no words. The rain had stopped just before dawn, but the ground still held the weight of the storm. Mud covered everything, roads vanished beneath it, fences collapsed under its grip. Most people knew better than to travel this way, but he didn't come this way by accident. He had seen something from a distance, something strange near the old wire fence. At first, it looked like a sack, a dark, shapeless mound, half swallowed by the muck. But as he brought his horse to a slow stop and dismounted, a chill coiled around his spine. That wasn't a sack. It was a body, lying motionless, sunken into the earth as if the world had tried to forget it. He stepped closer, boots sinking into wet soil, and knelt beside the figure. Mud caked her face, her skin pale beneath it. An arm lay limp among the rocks, thin fingers curled as if frozen in time. She didn't stir, no breath, no sound, just silence. But then, a twitch, a shiver, a whisper of air, faint and broken, slipped through her cracked lips. She was alive. The man exhaled, long and slow, and for a moment, just watched her, watched the impossible. In this quiet, forgotten place, where the wind never spoke kindly and the land took more than it gave, someone had survived, barely. Without a word, he shrugged off his worn leather coat and wrapped it around her. Her limbs were cold, bruised, laced with cuts. Rope burns marked her wrists like a history he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. He lifted her carefully, cradling her weight as if she might vanish at any second. The only sounds were the distant whinny of his horse and the wind brushing the prairie. No witnesses, no answers. Just a girl, clinging to life, left for dead in the mud. He placed her gently across the back of his saddle. Taking her into town would raise questions, accusations, even. But leaving her here wasn't an option. Not now, not after that breath. As he turned his horse toward home, the gray sky stretched endlessly above them, heavy with secrets. Something had shifted, not just for her, not just for him, but for the land itself, as if it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. And in that silence, a story began, one that would burn its way through the dust, through blood and fire, until nothing remained untouched. Chapter 2. The Girl Without a Name. The ride back was quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind where silence presses against your chest like the barrel of a loaded gun. The man didn't speak, neither did the girl. She lay across the saddle, wrapped in his coat, her body limp, her breathing shallow. Every few minutes, he would glance back, just to make sure she was still there, still breathing, still real. The cabin sat at the far end of his land, where the hills dropped into low ravines and trees stood like old sentinels. It wasn't much. A roof, for walls, a fire that hadn't been lit in 2 days. He opened the door with one hand and carried her in with the other, placing her gently onto the straw bed near the hearth. She didn't stir, but her eyes, they were open, watching. He lit the fire first, not for warmth, but for light. The shadows had followed them all the way from that muddy stretch of road, and now they huddled in the corners of the room, waiting for the flames to speak. The girl blinked slowly, face pale beneath dried mud. Her lips parted, not to speak, but to breathe, sharp, shallow, controlled. He brought water, a wet cloth, and silence. As he knelt beside her, wiping the dirt from her face, she flinched. Not a loud movement, but a quiet one, like a leaf twitching in the wind. Her eyes didn't meet his. Not yet, but they were full of something strange, not just fear, but something harder, a kind of resistance, the kind that takes root deep in the bone. He asked her name. She didn't answer. He tried again, softer this time. What do I call you, girl? Still, nothing. No sound, no hint, just eyes, storm dark, watchful, waiting. By morning, she hadn't moved an inch. She ate what he left by the bed, drank from the tin cup when he wasn't looking. She never looked away from the door, or the windows, as if waiting for someone, or something. Her shoulders curled inward, her hands tucked beneath the blanket like a child hiding from monsters that still knew her name. but she had no name to give. He stopped asking. Some people speak with their voices, others speak with their silence. And the girl's silence said enough. She had been through fire, and she hadn't come out unburned. She wasn't just wounded, she was watching, measuring dot, and deep down she was still fighting. Chapter 3. A story on the town's tongue. The town was small, but its voice was sharp. It didn't take long for whispers to slither through its crooked alleys and creaky saloon doors. Word had gotten out. The old rancher had brought someone in, a girl, silent, bruised, with no name and no history, found half dead in the mud. They said, or maybe she wasn't half dead at all. Maybe she was running from something worse. No one asked him directly. They never did, but every time he rode into town for feed, tools, a bottle of something to forget, the stares followed him like dust on his boots. Women paused their stitching to lean closer to one another. Men at the bar shifted their weight, voices low and poisoned. She ain't his kin. One murmured, she's trouble. Another whispered, he didn't just find her, he bought her. He heard every word, even when they didn't say it out loud. He saw it in the way the barkeep took a second longer to hand him change, in how the blacksmith avoided eye contact, muttering something about keeping his daughter inside more often, and in how the preacher stopped nodding when they passed on Sundays. The girl never came into town. She stayed in the cabin, watching the land from behind the curtains, small hands pressed to the window pane, as if the world outside might recognize her and pull her back into something dark. He never forced her to leave the property. He wouldn't. Whatever she had fled, it had left marks on her, and not just the kind that faded, but the town didn't care for that kind of quiet. They wanted answers, stories. They began to tell their own. Some said she was a runaway outlaw's daughter. Others swore she had the devil's mark, born under a cursed star. A few claimed she'd set fire to her own home and fled as it burned behind her. Each tale more twisted than the last, and none true, but all believed. And in every version, the man who saved her was either a fool or something far worse. He said nothing. Let them talk. Let the wind carry their lies across the prairie like smoke from a fire no one dared to name. But back at the ranch, in the quiet between chores, he'd sometimes glance at the girl and wonder if even she knew where the truth ended, or if she'd buried it so deep she couldn't find it anymore. Chapter 4. The darkness that came from silence. Nights on the ranch were quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed in from the windows, settled in the corners, and breathed cold against the back of your neck. And it was in that silence that her fear took root. By day, she seemed almost still calm. Even she helped where she could, feeding the chickens, fetching water, always with her eyes cast downward, shoulders hunched like she was trying to shrink away from the sun. But at night, the silence broke. The first scream came without warning. It split the air like a crack of lightning, sharp and ragged, yanking the man from sleep. He rushed to her room, the small side space he'd cleared just for her, and found her tangled in blankets, eyes wide open but blind to the present. Her fists clenched around the air, her voice caught in her throat like a noose. He called her name, though she didn't have one, and she didn't answer. She never did. Not when she woke like this. Not when the past clawed its way through the darkness and dragged her back down into it. Some nights she cried. Other nights, she didn't make a sound, just rocked slowly on the edge of her bed, knees pulled to her chest, gaze locked onto a place only she could see. And he never asked, he never pushed, he just sat, sometimes outside her door, sometimes beside the fire, sometimes just in silence, offering his presence like a shield. Even if she didn't reach for it, he'd seen wounds before, knife cuts, gunshots, grazes, broken bones, but this was something different. The kind of wound that doesn't bleed, but still never heals. The kind that echoes long after the violence ends. The kind born in silence and nurtured by fear. And yet, even in her worst moments, there was something in her, a steel glint behind the terror, a spark that refused to go out. It was in the way she gritted her teeth after waking, in the way she refused to scream twice in the same night, in how, after each nightmare, she folded her blanket a little tighter, as if reclaiming order, one piece at a time. He never told her it would be okay. He didn't lie, but he kept the fire going longer on those nights, sat closer, said nothing, and slowly, night after night, the silence between them began to shift. Not gone, but no longer the enemy. Chapter 5. A past that came with fire. The town had learned to live with its secrets, to bury them beneath dusty roads and shuttered windows. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when they come on horseback. They rode in just before sundown, 3 men, thick with trail dust and silence. They didn't speak much, didn't drink more than they needed to, and didn't smile at all. Their horses were lean and mean, like they'd been ridden hard and fed little. Their eyes scanned everything: windows, porches, the boots of every man who dared to meet their gaze. Strangers always meant one of 2 things in towns like this: trouble or payment for old trouble. And these men looked like they'd come to collect. They didn't ask for names outright, just descriptions, hints, quiet questions posed to barkeeps and stable boys. But the picture one of them carried, worn, creased, almost torn, told more than words ever could. A young girl, dark eyes, thin frame, a look that was part sorrow, part challenge. One man swore he recognized the look. Another claimed he saw someone like her a few weeks back, out near the rancher's land. And just like that, the story changed again. The saloon filled with whispers. The post office kept its door half shut. Even the preacher's wife made the sign of the cross twice as she passed by the general store. They didn't know who she was, not exactly, but now they thought they knew. And that was enough. That evening, the rancher felt the change in the wind before he saw the smoke. He had gone to mend the south fence, hammering quietly as dusk settled in. The prairie was still, but the stillness wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the land itself had drawn a breath and was waiting to release it. By the time he returned home, the girl was already at the window, motionless, her hands clenched at her sides. "They're here," she said, her voice nearly a whisper. He didn't need to ask who. Out beyond the tree line, near the edge of the property, a lone figure stood, hat low, coat torn, body leaning like someone who'd traveled a long way, not for rest, but for reckoning. Later that night, she told him everything: the fire, the screams, the men, the house, how they'd come for someone else but taken her instead, how she escaped while the place burned, how she didn't light the match but didn't stop it either. She had no name, she said, because they'd tried to erase it, so she erased it first. He didn't say a word, just listened. "I won't bring fire here," she said finally, standing by the door with her small bundle of belongings. "I won't ruin what's left of peace." "You didn't bring it," he said, voice steady. She looked at him, eyes glistening but dry. "But I didn't outrun it either." And out there, beyond the dark hills, the fire of her past smoldered, not in flames, but in the eyes of men who refused to let go. They had come not for justice, but for the piece of her she still held. And this time, she wasn't sure if running would be enough. Chapter 6. The day she first spoke, the house had grown quieter with every passing day, not from lack of sound, but from the weight of things left unsaid. She hadn't run, not when she saw the men in town, not when she felt their eyes in the trees, not even when the fear returned in full force, the kind that made her hands tremble when she poured water, the kind that made sleep feel like surrender. She stayed, but she hadn't spoken, not once, not even a breath longer than necessary, until now. It was morning, pale, sunless. The fire in the hearth was little more than embers, and the man was at the table, carving a sliver of wood with the patience only silence can teach. She stood in the doorway, hair loose, arms folded across her chest, face unreadable. He didn't look up. She hadn't made a sound walking in. She never did. The floorboards had learned not to betray her. But then she said it, a single word: "Stay." It was so soft, he nearly missed it, but it struck like thunder. He looked up slowly, knife frozen in mid-motion. Her eyes met his for the first time in days. No hiding behind the curtains, no stolen glances across the room. Just her, exposed, trembling, speaking. "Please, don't send me away." He didn't answer. Didn't need to, because she wasn't finished. "I know they're coming. I know what they want. I know what I've done, but I'm tired of running. If they burn this place, I want to burn with it. But not alone." There was no drama in her voice, no shaking sobs or performative pain, just truth, plain, hard, and raw like winter air. Her voice was rough from disuse, fragile and frayed at the edges, but it held something deeper than strength. It held resolve. She walked to the table, sat across from him, and placed her hands on the worn wood, small, scarred hands that had been bound, had dug through mud, had shaken in fear. Now they were still. "You saved me once," she whispered, "but I want to save something too." The fire crackled, catching new breath. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes changed, a shift, subtle and deep. He reached over, gently turned her palm up, and laid a small iron key into her hand. "For the gun cabinet," he said, "only if you're sure." She nodded. "I don't want revenge," she added. "I want a life, even if it's a small one." Outside, the land stretched quiet and gray, as if holding its breath. The trees didn't move, the sky didn't blink, but inside the cabin, something had finally broken. Not like glass, but like ice thawing under spring. She had spoken, not because she was no longer afraid, but because fear was no longer in control, and for the first time since she'd collapsed into the mud, her voice carried forward, not backward, not a memory, but a vow. Chapter 7. The night of the attack. It began with the silence. A silence so complete, it pressed against the windows like a second layer of glass. No wind, no coyotes, not even the creak of the barn roof. Just the stillness of a land holding its breath, and a girl who had finally decided not to run. She had braided her hair tight, tucked her fear beneath a thick coat, and sat by the window with the rifle across her lap. The man said nothing. He had loaded his own weapon hours ago, set the lanterns low, and poured 2 cups of water. One remained untouched. Outside, the moon hid behind clouds like it, too, didn't want to see what was coming. Then, the dogs growled. Not the warning bark of curious animals. No, this was deeper. A sound that came from instinct, from knowing that what approached did not belong. She stood. He did too. A soft knock came at the back door, not sharp, calculated. Then, a voice followed, calm and unfamiliar, but dripping with the kind of cruelty that wears civility like a coat. "Evening. We know she's inside. Just hand her over, and we'll leave the land untouched." Neither moved. Another pause. Then, the voice again, this time closer to a smile. "You've been real kind to her. But kindness don't change what she did. You know that." She looked at the rancher. He looked at her. That was all. The next sound was the shatter of glass, back window. Then a boot through the barn door. Then fire. They lit it from 3 corners, the same way they always did. Trapped the horse, choked the air, forced surrender. But she didn't flinch. The rifle stock was cold in her hands, heavy, but familiar now. She moved to the kitchen window, peered out into the dark. Flames began licking the edges of the barn, casting wild shadows across the pasture. Figures moved within them, 6, maybe 7, all armed, all hunting. The rancher took position by the front. She stayed to guard the rear. The first shot came from the trees. She ducked. Glass sprayed across the floorboards. Her ears rang, but her grip never loosened. She saw one of them, a thin man with a crooked stance, moving fast across the clearing. She inhaled, exhaled, squeezed the trigger, missed the kick slammed into her shoulder. She gritted her teeth, chambered another round. Second shot low. He dropped, somewhere beyond the barn. The horses screamed. Inside, smoke began to leak through the gaps in the doorframe. They were going to burn everything, not just the girl, her story, her name, the land that dared give her shelter. The man moved swiftly, calm, steady. He didn't shoot to kill unless he had to. But tonight, the rules had changed. He was protecting more than his home. And she wasn't hiding anymore. She crawled through the hall, pressed her back to the fireplace. Another bullet punched through the front door, then another. Her chest rose and fell in short bursts, but not from panic, from purpose. She turned, peeked through the side window, and there he was, the man with the melted jaw, the one who had stood beyond the trees. He wasn't firing, he was watching, waiting for her. And she knew this wasn't about debt or bounty or land. This was about memory and shame, and the fact that she had lived when she wasn't supposed to. Her hands trembled, but her feet moved toward the front door, toward the fire, toward the past. The rancher stepped in front of her, not to stop her, but to ask, without words, "Are you sure?" She nodded, then opened the door. Smoke curled like fingers across the porch. Flames painted the sky in angry orange strokes, and the men stood there, forming a half-circle of threat and arrogance. But the girl didn't step back. She raised her voice, clear, cracked, but unmistakably her own. "You want to finish what you started," she called out. "Then face me." The silence that followed was heavy. Then a laugh. Then another gun raised, but this time, she fired first. Chapter 8. The Daughter of the Land. By dawn, the flames were out. Smoke still curled lazily from the blackened skeleton of the barn, rising into a sky painted in cold shades of blue and ash. Embers glowed faintly beneath the ruin, but the threat was over. The men who had come for her were gone, some bleeding into the soil, others fleeing into the hills where no law would follow. The girl stood barefoot on the porch, coat draped over her shoulders, soot on her face like war paint. She did not tremble. The rifle was still in her hand, lowered now, but not forgotten. Beside her, the rancher leaned against the railing, silent, as always, but with something softer in his eyes, not relief, not pride, something deeper, recognition that she had stood her ground, and, in doing so, something had shifted. Later that morning, as the sun pulled itself over the ridge and painted light across the battered land, the first wagon arrived, then another. By noon, half the town stood at the fence line, hesitant, wide-eyed, awkward. They came without rifles, without judgments. They brought bread, wool, tools, quiet apologies wrapped in the shape of necessities. The preacher's wife offered a scarf. The blacksmith brought nails and a quiet nod. Even the barkeep, who had once refused to speak her name, handed over a basket of dried apples and said, simply, for winter. No one spoke of what had happened the night before. Not directly, but they all knew. Word had traveled faster than fire. How she'd taken the shot, how she hadn't run, how she'd stood in front of the porch, spine straight, voice steady, and demanded to be seen, not as a ghost from the mud, not as a rumor in the saloon, but as a woman who had chosen to stay and fight. She didn't say much to them. She didn't need to. Her silence was no longer mistaken for weakness now. It was a kind of language, a language the land understood. That evening she walked the property, alone, not to patrol, but to feel it. The grass, the wind, the earth beneath her boots. There were no more fences in her mind. No more doors she wasn't allowed to open. This land, scorched as it was, still lived. She knelt in the field beside the smoldered barn and dug her fingers into the soil, the ash mixed with dirt, with memory, with blood. And in that moment, she understood something unspoken. Not all roots grow from peace. Some grow from fire. Behind her, the rancher stood quietly. He said her name, the name she'd finally whispered to him before sleep the night before. And she turned, not in surprise, but in affirmation. Yes, she said, that's who I am. That night, the stars returned, not to watch, but to witness. For the first time in a long time, she slept with the window open. No nightmares came. No ghosts rattled the floorboards. Just the soft hum of crickets and the creak of wood settling after a long strain. She was no longer the girl found in the mud. She was the daughter of the land, and the land, scorched, quiet, scarred, had claimed her back. Chapter 9. The Guardian's ISC knew the sound of every hinge now. The one on the back gate that moaned in the cold. The creak of the stable door when the wind shifted from the north. The soft, near-silent scrape of boot soles on the porch. When someone approached without wanting to be heard, nothing escaped her anymore. The land was no longer a mystery. It was muscle memory. Before, she had watched the ranch like someone waiting for it to vanish, a dream that would dissolve in morning light. But now, she walked it with purpose. She no longer flinched at every rustle in the trees. She no longer checked the door twice before sleeping. Now, she checked for tracks in the dry soil, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. She had become the watcher, the sentinel, the eyes of the land. At dawn, she circled the perimeter. She knew where the fence line sagged from too much rain. She knew which stones near the creek held fox dens underneath. She carried a rifle slung across her back, not out of habit, but out of memory. Not all wounds bled, and not all battles ended with a gunshot. She learned the names of birds, the language of their warnings. A hawk's sudden flight meant something below had moved. A cluster of crows near the southern hill meant death, recent, or soon to come. The rancher let her lead. He didn't say it aloud. He didn't have to. She saw it in the way he deferred to her gaze, the way he stepped aside when she nodded toward the broken trough, the way he asked, with just a glance, which trail to take when the cattle wandered too far west. He had always protected this land. Now, he shared that burden. At night, she sat on the porch, hat pulled low, eyes scanning the dark like it was a map only she could read. The firelight behind her cast a faint silhouette against the cabin walls, a figure not of fragility, but of steadiness. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. The ranch spoke through her now. And when the town folk rode past on their way to the canyon, They'd tipped their hats, not out of politeness, but out of respect for her, and for the silence she stood in. They knew the stories, they knew where she came from, but no one spoke of it anymore. That part of her was buried now. What had risen in its place was something different, something stronger. She had mapped every creak in the floorboards, every breath of wind that bent the prairie grass, every shift in the shadow of the hills at dusk. The land had once saved her. Now, she saved it in return. And, if danger came again, if hoofbeats rose in the distance, or smoke curled on the horizon, she would see it first. She would be ready, because she was not just the girl who had survived. She was the guardian, and the land was watching through her eyes. Chapter 10. A name written in fire autumn came without ceremony. No storm, no frostbite, just a slow, golden fading. The prairie grasses turned from green to rust. The wind lost its summer breath and took on the hush of colder things. And in the silence of that change, something else shifted too. The papers were old, folded and yellowed at the edges. The ink had faded, but the meaning was clear. A deed, a name, a line of ownership that had once been passed from father to son, now placed gently in her hands. She stared at it for a long time. The rancher said nothing. He simply watched her, the way the land watches the rain, patient, knowing it might never come again, but still hoping. She looked up, blinking, unsure if what she held was real, or a kindness she hadn't earned. "I didn't build this place," she whispered. "I only defended it." "You became it," he replied. That night, she sat by the fire with the document in her lap, fingers grazing its edges like it might dissolve. Outside, the wind carried the soft sounds of livestock settling for the night. Inside, the house was warmer than she remembered, not from the fire, but from presence. From memory turned into trust. The next morning, she did something no one expected. She carved her name into the beam above the front door, not with a flourish, not big, just quiet letters burned into the wood grain with a hot iron and a steady hand. The name she had whispered weeks ago, the one she had almost forgotten, the one no man had given her, the one she took back. She didn't call anyone to see. She didn't need witnesses. The land was watching. From then on, she rose with the sun. Not as a guest, not as a survivor, but as the woman who belonged. She walked the fields with bare hands, touching the dirt like it was a friend, not a wound. She learned the stories of the orchard trees. She patched fences as if mending old bones. She spoke less and smiled more, though only to herself. And when children from town wandered too close to the pasture, she didn't chase them away. She offered water, told them where to step, helped them name the birds overhead. No one called her the girl anymore. They called her by her name. And when folks asked the rancher why he handed over the deed, why he trusted someone whose past came soaked in fire and shadow, he would only shrug and say, because she never asked for it. In time, the story of the girl in the mud faded. People forgot the color of her wounds. They remembered only how she stood when others would have fled, how she rebuilt what had burned, how she carved her name into wood, not to erase the past, but to mark her place inside it. Years later, when someone else sat on that porch, younger, wide-eyed, unsure, they'd look up and see the letters, carved into the beam, darkened by time, worn by sun and wind, and they'd ask, who was she? And the land, if it could speak, would answer. She was the flame that stayed, the one who wrote her name, not in ink, not in stone, but in fire.